The morning sky over Houston was gray, thick with clouds as if warning that something unusual was about to unfold. Mark Henderson wiped the grease off his hands, his fingers aching from hours under the hood of a rusted-out Dodge Caravan. His shop, tucked between a laundromat and a liquor store, wasn't much, but to him, it was home. He didn't fix cars for riches. He fixed them for people who couldn't afford to break down. And that morning, fate rolled into his garage on 4 squealing tires and a story that would shake the world. A woman in her late 30s stepped out of a battered Lexus, her face pale, her eyes glassy with panic. Her name was Jenna Collins, and she was holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 7, maybe 8, whose oxygen tank hissed quietly at her side. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, "my son's due for his treatment in 2 hours. I can't afford a delay." Mark's eyes dropped to the kid's face, sunken yet hopeful, and he didn't ask a single question. He simply nodded and got to work. While others might have quoted a $1,000 repair and waved her off, Mark dove beneath the Lexus like it was his own child's life on the line. Every twist of the wrench was an act of defiance against a world that had failed people like Jenna. He saw the cracked radiator, the failing fuel line, the years of neglect brought on not by irresponsibility, but by survival. With every bead of sweat, he made a silent vow. No mother should beg for mercy when it's her child's life at stake. 2 hours later, the Lexus roared back to life, smoother than it had in years. Jenna clutched her son and cried, offering to write a check she knew would bounce. Mark gently shook his head. "Some debts aren't meant to be paid in money," he said. She didn't know what to say, so she just hugged him, tight, like he'd rewired not just her car, but her entire fate. Then she drove off, taillights fading into the haze, unaware of the storm she had just set in motion. That night, Jenna posted the story on Facebook with trembling fingers and a single photo. Mark, smeared in oil, standing beside her revived Lexus, smiling with tired eyes. "This man saved my son's life today," she wrote. "He didn't ask for $1. He just fixed what needed fixing." By dawn, the post had over 1 million shares. And by lunchtime, the man who walked into Mark's garage wore a suit worth more than the whole block, and his last name had its own wing in half the hospitals in Texas. Mark barely looked up when the black Escalade purred into his lot, its windows so dark they looked painted on. The driver stepped out first, tall, built like security, scanning the area like a bodyguard in a war zone. Then the passenger door opened, and out stepped a man whose face Mark had only seen once on the cover of Forbes. Anthony Caldwell. Tech, mogul, billionaire, philanthropist, ruthless investor, and the last person you'd expect to show up at a greasy corner shop in East Houston. Mark Henderson. Caldwell's voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, the kind that made people sit up straighter. Mark nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen too many engines and not enough bleach. "I heard what you did for the woman and her boy," Caldwell said. "Tell me, did you know who she was?" Mark blinked. "A mother in trouble." Caldwell stared at him for a long, unreadable moment, then gave a short, dry laugh. "Interesting. Jenna Collins wasn't just any mother. She was the sister of Caldwell's late wife. And the boy, his nephew, estranged from the family for years, cast out after Caldwell refused to forgive debts owed by Jenna's husband before he died. What Mark had unknowingly done wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a defiant reversal of a billionaire's cold judgment. And now that billionaire stood there, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous: curiosity. Caldwell walked slowly around the garage, his expensive shoes tapping against the oil-stained concrete like gunshots in a silent chapel. You fixed her car, saved her boy, asked for nothing. That kind of man doesn't exist anymore. So tell me, what's your price?" Mark didn't flinch. "I didn't do it for money." Caldwell's gaze hardened. "Everyone has a price." Mark stepped forward, unshaken. "Then you're talking to the wrong man." For a full beat, the two locked eyes, two worlds colliding, grease and gold, humility and power. The silence shattered when Caldwell suddenly pulled out a checkbook and scribbled a number. He ripped the check and held it out. Mark glanced down. $500,000. For upgrades, repairs, whatever this place needs. Mark didn't move. Caldwell folded the check, laid it on the counter, and looked back with a smirk. "Keep being the man you are, but be ready, Mr. Henderson. When word gets out, kindness like yours doesn't go unnoticed or unchallenged." And just like that, the billionaire disappeared as quickly as he came, leaving behind a storm Mark never saw coming. Mark stood frozen, the weight of the billionaire's visit sinking in like a chill in his bones. But his thoughts weren't on the check or the polished threat that hung in the air. His mind went back to the boy, Eli, the way his tiny hand clung to his mother's, the way his eyes, though dimmed by illness, still lit up when the engine roared back to life. There was no pretense in that smile, no calculation, just pure, innocent hope from a child who'd seen too many hospital rooms and not enough playgrounds. That moment haunted Mark, not in a heavy way, but in the kind of way that reminded you what real purpose feels like. He hadn't saved a car that day. He'd salvaged a chance for a child to breathe easier for one more afternoon. Jenna didn't carry herself like a woman desperate for attention or pity. She was worn, bone-tired, the kind of tired that seeps into your soul and stays there. Yet she never begged for more than help with a car. She didn't cry until the job was done. That quiet strength shook something in Mark. The neighborhood wasn't kind to people like Jenna. No husband. Medical bills piling up. Judged by strangers for needing help, then blamed for accepting it. But Mark saw something different. He saw a mother willing to sell her pride for her son's heartbeat. And when she hugged him, tight, shaking, he felt her gratitude without words. She whispered, "People like you don't happen often." But what she didn't know was that people like her were the reason people like him existed. Mark wasn't a saint. He'd made mistakes, lost jobs, missed rent. There were years when he lived out of his own car, scraping by with nothing but a socket wrench and a stubborn heart. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be seen only when someone needed labor, not kindness. Maybe that's why he never turned people away. Not because he was trying to be good, but because he remembered what it felt like to have no one show up. His kindness wasn't for show. It was survival passed forward. What made the world go silent that day wasn't just the billionaire's money or the viral post. It was the raw contrast. A hardened mechanic with oil-stained hands had done more for a dying child than men with empires. It was the truth that stung, that sometimes the people with the least to give gave the most. And in a world starving for real compassion, Mark's quiet, instinctive decency had become louder than any donation ever could. In the days that followed, Mark's garage became a quiet storm of attention. News crews, curious neighbors, out-of-towners, driving miles just to shake his hand, but he hadn't changed. He still opened shop at sunrise, still drank his bitter coffee black, still charged $40 for a job worth double. When someone asked if he felt like a hero, he laughed. "I just fixed a car." But deep down, he started to realize maybe cars had never been the real story. Maybe what he was really repairing was something bigger. Across town, in a mansion with glass walls and floors polished like mirrors, Anthony Caldwell sat in silence, watching the viral video of Jenna's teary gratitude for the 100th time. The billionaire who once believed everything could be solved with a checkbook felt something crack inside him. Guilt was foreign to him, something he'd dismissed as weakness, but this time it clawed at his throat. Mark hadn't just shamed him. Mark had woken him up. For the first time in years, Anthony saw his wealth for what it really was, powerless in the face of human decency. That night, he wandered through his empty halls, remembering the promises he made to his wife before cancer took her. Promises to take care of her family, to never become hollow. He had failed, and it took a mechanic with nothing but a wrench and a clean heart to show him what that failure looked like. The next morning, Anthony didn't go to his office. He went to Jenna's house with flowers for Eli and tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," he whispered. "Tell your son. His uncle remembers now." Jenna stood there in shock, her breath catching as Anthony dropped to one knee in front of the boy he'd once turned away. Eli didn't understand it all. He only knew that the rich man everyone feared looked scared himself now. With fragile fingers, Eli reached out and touched his uncle's face. "You don't have to be scared," he said simply. That moment, so innocent, so undeserved, struck Anthony like a lightning bolt. Redemption wasn't a gift you earned. It was one you accepted when someone smaller, weaker, still believed you were worth saving. Mark never asked for thanks. He didn't even know what was happening behind the scenes. But his act, the small, quiet, gut-level choice to do right without reward, had shaken something asleep in a man who thought he had everything. And through that ripple, a boy got his family back. A sister got her dignity returned. A billionaire got a soul reset. And maybe, just maybe, the world tilted a little closer to grace. It was late afternoon when Mark finally got a break. He stepped outside his shop sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the street shimmer under the Houston sun. That's when a white van pulled up, and Jenna stepped out, this time dressed better, her hair combed, her eyes clearer. In her arms was Eli, smiling brighter than Mark remembered. But they weren't alone. Behind them stood Anthony Caldwell, holding a folded wheelchair in one hand, and in the other, a framed photo of his late wife. Mark blinked, confused. Jenna nodded gently. "He wanted to come see you." Anthony walked forward slowly, his voice softer than ever. "I never thanked you, Mark. I don't think I can. Not in any way that would match what you gave me." Mark started to shake his head, but Anthony raised the frame. "This was my wife, the strongest woman I ever knew. And that little boy in your garage is the last part of her left in this world. I was too blind to see that." His voice cracked, and the billionaire, once proud, untouchable, wiped a tear with the back of his hand. Then Eli wiggled out of his mother's arms and ran, limping, struggling, but determined. He flung himself into Mark's arms with all the strength he had. "Mom says you're why I can still breathe," he whispered. Mark froze, arms trembling as he held the boy close, the sound of his oxygen tank hissing like a clock counting grace. For a long, aching moment, no one spoke. Jenna cried quietly. Anthony looked down, ashamed but humbled. And Mark, so used to being unnoticed, stood there as the center of something he never asked for, something purer than anything money could buy. "I want to be like you when I grow up," Eli said, muffled into Mark's shirt. That broke him. The walls around his heart, built from years of pain and pretending it didn't hurt, they crumbled. His throat tightened as he held the boy tighter. "You already are, kiddo," he whispered. braver than I'll ever be." In that moment, time felt suspended. The mechanic, the mother, the billionaire, and the sick little boy, all bound by something invisible but unshakable. A kindness that crossed class, pain, and pride. And for the first time in his life, Mark let himself cry. Not because he was sad, but because he finally realized he mattered. 2 days after that tearful reunion, Mark arrived at the garage to find an envelope taped to the front door. Thick, white, no stamp, just his name in elegant handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from Anthony Caldwell. But it wasn't a thank you. It was a confession, a story, a truth Mark never saw coming. "Mark," the letter began, "what I didn't tell you the day I came to your shop is this. My visit wasn't by accident. I was watching you for weeks." Anthony explained that after Jenna's desperate message to him went ignored, she had uploaded a video pleading for help. A private message, never meant to go public. But it had leaked. And in the days that followed, his team tracked everything: who approached her, who turned away, and finally, the mechanic who stepped up. Mark. They watched him offer help without hesitation, and that moment, caught on security camera, had gone straight to Anthony's desk. That was when things shifted, because Caldwell realized something terrifying. He wasn't the only one watching. Mark's act of kindness had been intercepted not only by Anthony, but by someone else. A rival billionaire, a ruthless tech competitor with a history of buying people like chess pieces. He had seen the same footage, and unlike Anthony, he didn't want to reward Mark's heart. He wanted to control it, use it. Mark was now a symbol, viral, pure, loved. The perfect face for a campaign, a brand, a public image. And that man was coming for him. At the bottom of the letter was a name, Vincent Gray, a man whose empire was built not on innovation, but manipulation. He had already offered Mark's landlord triple the market value for the garage. He'd filed permits to rezone the area, and quietly, silently, he was preparing to turn the entire block into luxury towers, with Mark as the poster boy of a lie. Mark stumbled back as he read. The garage he thought was safe, the small, greasy sanctuary built on sweat and honesty, was under threat from someone who had never met him but wanted to wear his kindness like a costume. His truth, his soul, was being auctioned behind closed doors, and that's when the final part of the letter hit hardest. "I've done many terrible things in my life," Anthony wrote, "but I won't let someone like Gray steal what's pure. If you'll let me, Mark, I want to stand beside you, not as a billionaire, but as a man trying to make something right." A key was taped to the back of the letter, a key to an office downtown, a building in Mark's name. "A backup plan," the note said, "if your world burns." Mark's knees buckled. Everything he had built was now a battlefield. His kindness had saved a boy, but might cost him everything. And now, the question wasn't what he would do. It was who he could trust, because the world had seen his heart, and some wanted to protect it, but others wanted to rip it out and sell it. Mark sat in the quiet of his garage, the walls now closing in on him. The letter from Anthony Caldwell weighed on him, its contents ringing in his ears like a war drum. His sanctuary, the place he had built, with nothing but his hands, was under siege by forces he never even knew existed. And then there was Vincent Gray, the man who had turned his kindness into an asset to be owned. The truth was, Mark had never cared for the spotlight. His whole life had been spent in the shadows, with oil stains and grease on his hands, never looking for more than what he needed to survive. But now, he realized that the world had seen him, not as a mechanic, but as something bigger. And with that came consequences. For days, Mark wrestled with his options. Anthony Caldwell had given him the key to a new future, a chance to step into a world of wealth, power, and recognition. He could take it all, the office downtown, the money, the resources. But deep down, he knew it wasn't his fight. It wasn't the life he wanted. The life that mattered was the one in his garage, the one that Eli, the mother, and the neighborhood had built with him. The quiet, unsung people who had never expected a handout, but always believed in what he did, what he stood for. And then came the call that would change everything. It was from his landlord, the same one who had always given him small extensions on rent, never raised his prices, and let him repair his own space without interference. But now, he was talking to Gray's people. The deal was almost done. Gray's company had bought up the block. Mark had no more time to fight back. His garage was about to be bulldozed to make room for another shiny tower, and he couldn't stop it. He had no money, no legal team, no means of protest. He was a small, insignificant pawn in the eyes of the billionaires. But in that moment, Mark did something that would go unnoticed by everyone but him. He walked into the garage early one morning, the soft hum of the world still quiet. He grabbed his tools, his wrench, his rag, his oil, and he worked. All day, all night. He fixed what was broken in the small machines, cleaned the floors, tightened the bolts. Every corner of the place was spotless by morning, the garage humming, with life, ready for its final shift. But Mark wasn't working for himself. He wasn't fixing things to stay afloat or make a name. He was fixing it because it was his. And for the first time, he realized it was enough. No matter how the world saw him, this place was his contribution to the world, his quiet act of sacrifice. In the dead of night, he sent an anonymous letter to Gray's team. The letter simply said, "I'm leaving. I'm walking away quietly. There's nothing here for you. Take the land, but leave the people alone." Next day, Mark packed his tools, closed the door to his garage, and left. He didn't tell anyone. No farewells, no grand speeches, no calls to the press. He walked out of the life he had built, knowing that his silent sacrifice was the one thing he could give to the world without ever asking for anything in return. The garage sat empty for weeks. People speculated, wondered what happened. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that Mark Henderson, the mechanic who had once saved a boy, had given up everything he'd built just to keep the soul of his community intact. He had chosen to walk away because in that silence, he realized something vital, that not all battles are meant to be won. Sometimes, the greatest act of strength is to quietly let go of the things that keep you tied down so that others might flourish, and so Mark vanished. He wasn't gone forever, though. The legacy of his sacrifice lingered, whispered in the streets of East Houston. The mechanic who had put others before himself, the man who had chosen love over fame, community over wealth. People spoke of him, but only in hushed tones, because those who truly understood his decision knew the price he'd paid. As for Anthony Caldwell, he never forgot Mark's quiet strength. In his darkest moments, when the weight of his empire felt like too much, he remembered the mechanic who had acted without expecting anything, and that memory stayed with him forever. Mark didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need recognition. He had done what few ever could. He had shown the world the true meaning of sacrifice, and in that silent act, he had won something far more. Valuable than wealth or power, he had won peace within himself. And so Mark's story ended not with grandeur, but with the soft hum of an empty garage where once a mechanic had rebuilt more than machines. He had rebuilt hope. Mark had been in some tough situations before, scraping by in a world that didn't care much for a mechanic's worth. He'd fought battles with cars, tools, and sometimes his own pride. But this was different. This wasn't about engines or oil stains. This was about people, about a child who needed a future, about a community that had stood by him when no one else had. The weight of it hit him one cold morning as he sat in the garage, hands wrapped around a cup of steaming coffee. The letter from Anthony Caldwell still sat in front of him, the words burning into his mind. Gray is coming for everything. And just like that, everything changed. The garage wasn't just a place to work anymore. It was a symbol, a lifeline. For the people around him, Jenna, Eli, the families he'd come to know over the years, and it was under threat. Mark couldn't just walk away. That wasn't who he was. The protective instinct inside him flared. His hands clenched the cup tighter, the edges of the ceramic digging into his skin. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land or a building made of concrete. He was protecting everything that had made him feel human in this world. His community, his integrity, the lives of the people who had found safety in this humble garage. Without thinking twice, he stood up, pacing. There were no more second thoughts, no more waiting around to see if someone else would do the right thing. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a politician. He was a mechanic, but he had something far more valuable. He had willpower, and that would be enough. He called Anthony that night, his voice low but determined. "I'm not selling. You tell Gray I'll go down fighting. I won't let him take this place, not without a fight." The conversation was brief, but Mark could feel Anthony's concern, the unease in his tone. The billionaire had tried to stop him, offered to pull strings, but Mark wasn't hearing it. "This is mine, Anthony, and I'll protect it, no matter what." The line went quiet for a second. Anthony didn't argue. He understood. The next morning, Mark walked into the garage, eyes steely and focused. The doors creaked open as he flipped the sign from closed to open. The shop was quiet, but he wasn't waiting for the sound of car engines. He was waiting for something bigger. He was waiting for Gray's people to show up. And when they did, he wouldn't back down. That's when Jenna appeared, her face worn from worry. "Mark, please," she whispered, walking toward him. "You're not thinking this through. Gray has connections. If you fight him, if you try to resist, there's nothing you can do. It'll be over." Her voice trembled, the fear and exhaustion in her eyes telling a story that was hard to ignore. Mark turned, locking eyes with her. There was no trace of fear in him, only something stronger. "I've got to protect you, Jenna. All of you. I can't sit back and let someone tear apart what's left of this community. If I let him do this, what happens to the people who have nowhere else to go? What happens to Eli?" Jenna's eyes welled up with tears, but Mark's gaze was steady. "I fought for less, Jenna. But this?" He shook his head, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "This is something worth fighting for." As the day wore on, Mark set to work, not on cars, but on his plan. He worked quickly, setting up a defense, contacting old friends, those who owed him favors, and those who would understand the fight he was taking on. Word spread fast. Mark Henderson wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was the last line of defense between a greedy billionaire and the only thing that mattered to the people of this neighborhood: home. By the time Gray's representatives arrived, Mark was ready. But there was something in his stance that had changed. Something deeper than just the refusal to give up. It wasn't pride anymore. It was something raw, primal, protective. He wasn't just defending a garage or a piece of property, he was defending the very heart of his world. Gray's men were well-dressed, calm, and efficient. But Mark? Mark stood at the front of the garage, his face hard and unyielding. He crossed his arms, the sun setting behind him, casting long shadows across the pavement. The leader of Gray's team stepped forward, a briefcase in hand. "Mark Henderson?" he asked, his voice measured and businesslike. "That's me," Mark replied, his voice steady, full of quiet force. "You're not welcome here. Not today. Not ever." The man frowned. "This can go one of two ways. You can take the money and we'll walk away. Or you can resist. But you'll lose, Mr. Henderson, and we will take everything." Mark's eyes narrowed, his chest swelling with an emotion so strong it almost felt like a physical force. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but fierce. "I've lost before, I've had nothing, and I'm still standing. But this place, these people, they don't belong to you. You'll have to tear it from my hands. And I'm not going down without a fight." The men exchanged glances, clearly unnerved by the fire in Mark's eyes. But they couldn't back down either. They were just doing their job. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Jenna arrived just as Mark spoke the last words. She stepped up next to him, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You'll have to go through all of us." And with that, the protective wall around Mark's world grew even stronger. He wasn't alone. He never had been. As the standoff continued, Mark's determination burned brighter. He wasn't going to let these men crush what he had fought for, what he had protected, with his sweat, blood, and tears. This wasn't just about one garage. This was about standing up for what's right, for the people who believed in him, who needed him. Mark's resolve was now as unbreakable as steel. There was no turning back. As Mark stood in the heart of the garage, the place that had been his world for so many years, the weight of it all pressed down on him. The battle he'd been fighting, the people he had sworn to protect. He felt the gravity of it all in a way he hadn't before. Despite the raw determination that had driven him, something lingered in his chest, gnawing at him. A deeper feeling he couldn't ignore. Regret. He thought of Jenna, of Eli. Their faces haunted him. The boy had so much potential, and Mark had been the one to offer him hope, to offer him the path to a better life. And yet, as the days passed, the realization hit him. Had he really done enough? Had he been enough for them? For anyone? Or had he let himself become so consumed by pride, by the need to prove something to the world, that he had lost sight of the quiet truth that had always mattered? Mark's mind wandered back to the beginning, before the viral moment, before Anthony Caldwell and Gray, before any of the riches or recognition. He remembered the lonely nights in his garage, working into the early hours of the morning with no one watching, no one to care. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to matter only as much as the car you fixed or the engine you rebuilt. And somewhere along the way, he had built a wall around himself, blocking out the connections he needed, the relationships that had always been right in front of him. It had never been about the work. It had always been about the people. As the tension with Gray escalated, Mark couldn't shake the guilt that festered inside him. He'd always been determined to do things on his own. He'd built everything from the ground up, and in some twisted way, he'd convinced himself that asking for help, leaning on others, was a sign of weakness. The loneliness had been a part of him for so long, he couldn't imagine life without it. But now he realized what he'd been missing. He remembered how much Jenna had trusted him, how Eli had looked up to him as more than just a mechanic, but as a father figure. These People, his community, had seen something in him that he had never been able to see in himself. And he had pushed them away, let them shoulder the weight of his insecurities without realizing how much they needed him to let go of that pride. The guilt crushed him. He had taken his independence to the extreme. He had made choices that had led him here, alone, at war with a billionaire over something that could have been prevented with a little more trust, a little more vulnerability. Why hadn't I seen this before? As he stood there in the garage, staring at the worn-down tools and the grease-covered walls, he made a decision. He wouldn't let his past mistakes define him. This wasn't about proving to the world that he could do it alone anymore. This wasn't about fighting just to fight or protecting the garage for his own ego. It was about redemption. It was about showing the people he had hurt that he could change, that he would change. Not just for them, but for himself. The phone call came late that night. It was from Anthony. The tone was urgent, tense. "Mark," Anthony said, his voice tight. "Gray's bought up all the local businesses. He's closing in on you. He's offering triple what you're asking. If you don't accept, this could get ugly. You need to make a decision, now, for a moment." Mark was silent. He could feel the weight of it all again, the pressure mounting on him, the thoughts racing. But as he looked out at the empty garage, the place that had seen his worst and best, the place where his heart had always been, he realized something. "I'm not selling," Mark replied, his voice steady. "But I won't do this alone. I can't. I'm asking for help. Your help." The words were out before he could stop them. Mark had always prided himself on doing things on his own, but now he understood the power of unity, of community. He couldn't win this fight by himself, and he didn't need to. This was his moment to redeem not just the garage, but the relationships he had neglected, the people who had always been there for him. Anthony was silent for a long moment. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure," Mark replied, his voice low but full of determination. "I've made a lot of mistakes, but I won't make this one. I need you, all of you, behind me. If I'm going to save what matters, I have to do it together." The next few days passed in a blur of action. Anthony's team worked with Mark, pulling strings, navigating the legal hurdles, and calling in favors from every corner of the city. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about strategy, heart, and the belief that people, real people, could make a difference. Mark made amends with the landlord, apologizing for his stubbornness, and working with him to secure the garage. He reached out to Jenna, telling her everything that had been weighing on him. "I've been wrong," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I thought I could fix everything on my own, but I can't, and I need you to know I'm sorry. I'm here now, and I won't walk away." And when the final confrontation with Gray came, Mark stood side by side with those who had always believed in him. He didn't just fight for the garage. He fought for the community, for the people he had come to love. And as the dust settled, as the fight ended in his favor, he realized something deeper than victory. He had redeemed himself, not through fame or fortune, but through the people he had fought for, the relationships he had rebuilt. Mark had learned that redemption didn't come from achieving the impossible. It came from embracing the people you loved and finally, letting them embrace you back. The tension had been building for weeks. Every moment felt like it was stretching time, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Mark had fought hard to keep his community safe, but the enemy he was up against wasn't just a wealthy businessman. It was a force much bigger than anything he had ever faced. The stakes were higher now, and his options were running out. Mark stood outside the garage one late evening, the faint hum of traffic in the background as he stared at the street. The once vibrant neighborhood, filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing, was beginning to fade under the shadow of Gray's impending takeover. People were afraid. Some had already sold their properties and moved away. Others were on the verge of losing hope, too beaten down by the pressure. He was alone in this moment, standing at the crossroads of a decision he had been dreading. The dusty weight of what was at stake pressed on his chest like an unrelenting storm. In the distance, he could see Gray's representatives walking up the street, suits sharp and eyes cold. They had come to give him the last offer, an ultimatum. Sell the garage, take the money, walk away. But Mark knew there was no walking away from this. He walked into the garage, the doors creaking as they opened, a familiar scent of oil and steel filling the air. The place had always been more than just a business for him. It was a lifeline. It was the heartbeat of this community. And now it was more than just his battle to fight. It was everyone's. His hands gripped the workbench, the scarred wood, smooth beneath his fingertips. The memories flooded back. Every person who had ever walked through these doors, every car that had come in with a broken heart, and every person who had left with a repaired engine, and maybe, just maybe, a repaired spirit. This was what mattered. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about winning a battle for control. This was about people. But the fear crept in again. What if this was all for nothing? What if Gray had too much power, too much money, too many connections? Mark had always relied on himself, his hands, his tools, his work ethic. But now, he needed more than that, and he feared it wouldn't be enough. His heart sank as he looked at the fading light outside. He could hear the echo of his own doubt creeping in, but then something stirred within him, a flicker of hope. That's when Jenna appeared, her face drawn but resolute, standing at the door with Eli at her side. The boy was holding a small metal toy car, one of the first things Mark had given him when he first walked into the shop. It was a symbol, a reminder of the innocent trust that had kept him going all this time. "Mark, we can't just stand here. We have to do something," Jenna said, her voice quiet but strong. "Gray's coming. He's relentless. You've fought for so long, but now it's time to fight for all of us. You've shown us how to stand up, how to be strong. Don't stop now." Mark turned to her, his chest tight with emotion. Her words were a lifeline. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them until now. He'd been so caught up in the fight, in his own internal battle, that he'd forgotten why he was fighting. It wasn't just for the garage. It wasn't just for his pride. It was for people like Jenna, like Eli, like the community that had rallied around him. He looked down at Eli, who stared up at him with wide, trusting eyes. There was no fear there, only faith. And in that moment, the decision was made. Mark stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Jenna's. "You're right. It's not just about me anymore. It never was. We're stronger than they think. I'm not walking away. Not from this. Not from them." The sound of the approaching footsteps echoed louder in the distance, but Mark's resolve grew with each passing second. There was no more hesitation. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a battle for the soul of his community, for the people who had believed in him, who had stood by him through thick and thin. He wasn't going to let them down. Jenna smiled, a look of quiet pride in her eyes, as if she knew this moment had been coming all along. She placed her hand on his arm, and together they turned toward the doors of the garage. "We've got this," Mark said, his voice steady, a spark of defiance in his tone. And then the final confrontation began. The suspense reached its peak as Gray's representatives arrived, their cold, calculating eyes scanning the garage. They had come to put an end to it all, to force Mark into submission. But Mark stood firm, surrounded by the community that had always had his back. Jenna, Eli, Anthony, the people who had walked through the garage doors, all stood beside him, united. The tension in the air was palpable as Gray's men made their final offer, the weight of their words like a hammer striking metal. But Mark wasn't intimidated, not anymore. He knew now that the true battle wasn't about money, about property. It was about fighting for what truly mattered: his community, his people, and his dignity. "I'm not selling," Mark declared, his voice ringing out with a conviction that shook the air. "This isn't just a garage, this is a family, and I'll fight for them. I'll fight for us." The power of Mark's declaration echoed through the streets as the crowd behind him stood taller. This wasn't just about resisting Gray. It was about something far bigger. It was about finding the strength to stand up against the odds, to believe in something bigger than yourself. After the confrontation with Gray's men, everything seemed to fall silent. The tension in the air was thick, and Mark felt as though the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. Gray's cold, calculating voice still echoed in his mind, but Mark had stood his ground. He had refused to sell. He had refused to let them take everything he had worked for. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt the clarity of his purpose. As the dust settled, Mark turned to face the people who had stood by him. Jenna, Eli, Anthony, the workers in the garage, all of them had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. They had seen something in him that he had been too afraid to see. It wasn't the mechanic who could fix engines and build cars. It was the man who could bring a community together, who could inspire others to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Jenna walked up to him, her eyes filled with pride, but also something deeper, something that had been there all along, a quiet strength. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't just save the garage, you saved all of us." Mark didn't know what to say. For so long he had fought alone, thinking that his worth was tied to his ability to fix things, to make things right. But in that moment he realized that it wasn't about fixing the broken parts of the world. It was about fixing the broken parts of himself and allowing others to help. He wasn't alone anymore. Eli stood beside him, holding up the small toy car that Mark had given him so many years ago. It was worn down, but still in one piece, the symbol of Mark's legacy. "I knew you'd do it," Eli said, his eyes shining with unwavering trust. "You're the best." A lump formed in Mark's throat as he knelt down to look at the boy, the weight of all his regrets and his growth flooding through him. He had thought he wasn't enough, thought that the world would never see him as anything more than just a mechanic. But now, he knew that his worth had always been tied to something far greater than his hands or his skill. It was about heart. It was about the people you fought for, and he had fought for them with everything he had. The sound of distant sirens broke the stillness of the moment, but Mark didn't flinch. The world around him might still be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt grounded. The noise, the chaos, it didn't matter anymore. His mind was clear, his heart steady. Whatever came next, he knew he could handle it. He had found something within himself that he had been searching for his entire life. "We won't give up," Mark said, his voice quiet but firm. "This garage, this community, it's ours, and we'll protect it. We'll rebuild what we've lost, and we'll make sure it's stronger than before." Jenna smiled at him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "We'll rebuild it together." And that was it. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Mark had spent so long fighting for himself, for his pride, but now he was fighting for something greater, a future that he could build with the people who had always believed in him. And with that realization, the cloud of regret that had hung over him for so long finally lifted. He was no longer haunted by the past. The mistakes, the isolation, the doubts, they were gone. As the final legal papers were signed, and Gray's empire began to crumble, Mark stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by his team, his friends, and his family. It wasn't just a victory over a wealthy businessman. It was a victory for the heart and soul of a community that had refused to give up. The garage doors, which had once symbolized the end of something, now represented the beginning of something new. The fresh air that poured in from outside was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with hope. Mark had learned that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about finding the courage to stand up when everything seemed lost, and then embracing the people around you, allowing them to help you rebuild. The camera panned out, showing Mark standing tall, surrounded by those he had fought for. The sun was setting in the background, casting a warm glow over the garage. The future wasn't certain, but it no longer felt like something to fear. With clarity and hope in his heart, Mark knew one thing. He had found his place, his purpose, and his true legacy. And that was worth more than anything money could buy. As the screen faded to black, the words flashed across the screen. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won by fighting alone. They're won by choosing to stand together.